Welcome to Social Minds Behind the Headlines. My name is Elvira Katkowska, and in today's episode, we critically examine a sensationalist headline published by the Birmingham Mail: Killers and pedophiles eating weekly slap-up meals paid by taxpayers. I am joined by my fellow colleagues Anna, Douglas and Anka, each bringing a unique analytical lens grounded in psychology and media theory. We begin by looking at how this kind of headline steers emotion and contributes to what Stanley Cohen in 1972 described as a moral panic, a reaction where the media exaggerates threats to social order. Words like killers, pedophiles, and slap-up meals are emotionally loaded. They frame prisoners as villains and tax-paying citizens as victims. Greer and Jukes in 2005 argue that such language dehumanizes offenders and fuels public anger. From a cognitive standpoint, this type of headline can influence how we judge situations. People often rely on emotion, not facts, especially when stories are vivid or shocking. And what about those being compared to prisoners, like nurses? When they are framed as helpless while offenders are shown eating steak, it may trigger frustration or even emotional burnout. A psychodynamic lens suggests that headlines like this can steer deeper feelings tied to unfairness and control. This narrative does not just report, it divides. It creates clear heroes and villains, reinforcing stereotypes and simplifying complex issues. Anka, how do you see this kind of messaging playing out in the way the article was written?
Thank you, Elvira. The article works through framing, a media technique that shapes how we see events. As Robert Entman explains, framing highlights some details while leaving out others, shaping how people understand the story. Phrases such as mouth-watering options and high-quality butter hint at indulgence and unfairness. Instead of informing, the piece is crafted to inflame public feeling. From a behavioral perspective, repeated exposure to stories like this teaches the public to react with outrage. It strengthens the idea that prisoners are rewarded instead of punished. From a cognitive perspective, readers may form distorted beliefs, such as assuming all prisoners enjoy lavish meals without having any real evidence. The article claims inmates have a budget of £50 to spend on steaks and other treats. In reality, official government reporting shows the daily food allowance is only £2.70 per prisoner. That is quite a difference, so why do you think is the smaller figure never mentioned? Leaving it out exaggerates the impression of privilege and presents a misleading picture when the reality is modest and tightly controlled. And here is the contradiction. If prison is meant to punish, how can it also be portrayed as luxurious? This double message creates outrage but avoids any deeper understanding. What also matters is the silence around context. For example, cuts to prison budgets or pressures on the NHS are never mentioned. By excluding these, the headline channels frustration toward individuals instead of questioning wider policies. But why hide the bigger picture? So, this is not only about food. It is about shaping morality, deciding who deserves sympathy and who does not. Douglas, can you tell us what happens when people take these messages and begin to compare themselves with others?
Thanks, Anka. The question leads directly into social comparison theory, first introduced by Leon Festinger in 1954. He argued that people judge their own situation by comparing themselves to others. The headline does exactly this. It sets prisoners labeled as killers and pedophiles against nurses said to be queuing at food banks. That deliberate contrast creates a sense of unfairness. The use of heavy labels intensifies the gap. It's no longer simply about food, it becomes a moral contest. Who deserves more? When people see one group described as dangerous but comfortable, and another as hard-working yet struggling, the reaction is almost automatic. Frustration, resentment, even anger. Psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in the 1970s described the availability heuristic, our tendency to give weight to vivid examples that stick in the memory. The headline takes advantage of this. The shocking image of nurses at food banks lingers, while the broader context, like actual prisoners' budgets, fades into the background. This is where the comparison becomes powerful. It narrows public debate to a simple us versus them, distracting from bigger issues like the underfunding of public services. One key psychological idea here is social identity theory, which explains how we naturally divide the world into us and them. When media headlines pit dangerous prisoners against nurses struggling on the front lines, they activate this bias. People instinctively side with their in-group, perceiving nurses as part of us, and view prisoners as them, outsiders or threats. Research shows media framing often strengthens these divisions, deepening emotional reactions and social polarization. Understanding these helps us see why such stories spark strong feelings, but also why they can make it harder to have balanced conversation about complex issues like healthcare fundings or criminal justice reform. But it raises an important question. Anna, how reliable are these kinds of headlines when you look more closely at the evidence?
Thank you, Douglas. And the truth is, these headlines are often far less reliable than they seem. When we look closely at the evidence, we find that claims can be exaggerated, selective, or even misleading. That's why thinking carefully is very important when details are missing or biased. This headline is shocking and emotional, but it gives no real numbers, no breakdowns of costs, and no proof of what prisoners actually get. Without this information, readers react with feelings instead of thinking clearly. Psychologically, this can increase stress or frustration, especially for people already unhappy with the system. For nurses shown as struggling while prisoners seem to get special treatment, it can make frustration worse or even lead to burnout. From a thinking point of view, people may form wrong ideas, like believing nurses suffer while prisoners are rewarded, even though the evidence doesn't support this. As Kahneman explains, fast, emotional thinking usually takes over in these situations, while slow, careful thinking is needed to check what's really true. From a sociological view, the headline also shows bigger social problems. It sets disadvantaged groups against each other, offenders versus underpaid professionals, without showing structural issues like budget cuts or healthcare problems. The message is mixed. Prisons seem too soft, while real problems outside are ignored. In the end, just because something is in the news doesn't make it true. Headlines are made to create outrage, not to explain the facts. That's why it's important to ask who wrote it, what evidence they used, and why. Without careful thinking, feelings can take over and shape public opinion in the wrong way.
Thank you, Anna. As we have heard today, headlines like this can fuel fear, distort facts, and shape public opinion. That is why critical thinking matters. Ask questions, look deeper, and do not let outrage replace understanding. Until next time, stay curious and stay critical.